The text message arrived at 9:17 p.m. "Do you still have that blueberry pancake recipe?" I stared at the screen. For a moment, the room around me disappeared. Not because of the words, because of what they meant. My coffee sat untouched beside my recliner as my heart settled into an old rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Not panic, not fear, but focus. My daughter was in danger. Real danger. 18 years earlier, when Emily was 6 years old and convinced monsters lived under her bed, I'd taught her a game. If you ever need me and can't say so out loud, I told her, "You ask about blueberry pancakes." She had giggled. Why pancakes? Because nobody forgets pancakes. Over the years, it became a family joke, a secret between mother and daughter. She had never used it. Not once. Until now. I checked the timestamp. 3 minutes ago. I grabbed my keys. 5 minutes later, I was in my car. By the time the engine turned over, I wasn't Margaret Collins' retired grandmother in training with arthritis in her left knee and bird feeders hanging outside the kitchen window. I was simply a mother going to retrieve her child, and God help whoever stood in the way. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 58 years old. For 20 years, I served my country in places most people will never hear about, and operations I still can't discuss. My ex-husband Richard spent nearly all of those years believing I shuffled paperwork in some Navy office building. I never corrected him. That misunderstanding eventually became the foundation of our marriage, and then our divorce. To Richard, I was ordinary, safe, predictable. By the end, I was simply the dumpy housewife he enjoyed making jokes about in front of company. Funny thing about being underestimated. Sometimes it's the only advantage you need. 3 hours earlier, before the text message arrived, my Thursday evening had looked remarkably ordinary. I was sitting on the porch of my small home in Norfolk, Virginia, watching the sun settle behind the trees, while a pair of cardinals argued over the bird feeder. Retirement had taught me to appreciate quiet. After 20 years in uniform and another 10 rebuilding a life after divorce, quiet felt earned. My Labrador Murphy slept at my feet. The neighborhood kids rode bicycles up and down the street. Somewhere nearby, someone was grilling burgers. America in the summertime. Simple things. Good things. Then my phone rang. Emily. "Hey, Mom." Her voice sounded strained. "Tough day?" I asked. "You could say that." She hesitated. "Dad's been weird lately." I leaned back in my chair. Richard and weird lately had been traveling companions for most of his adult life. "What happened?" "He doesn't want me leaving for college." That got my attention. Emily had been accepted to the University of North Carolina months earlier. She planned to study nursing. We had celebrated with dinner at her favorite seafood restaurant. Even Richard had seemed excited. "He says North Carolina is too far away," she continued. "He wants me to stay here and attend community college for a year." Did he explain why? "He says family should stick together." I heard something else beneath her words. Fear. Not overwhelming fear, but concern. The kind that makes the hair rise on the back of your neck. "What do you want, sweetheart?" "I want the life I've worked for." There it was. The truth. I smiled despite myself. "Then that's the life you should have." She laughed softly. "You always make things sound simple." "No," I said. "I just learned a long time ago that difficult and complicated aren't the same thing." We talked another 15 minutes before hanging up. Nothing about the conversation suggested what was coming. Nothing except that quiet note in her voice. The one I couldn't quite place. Richard and I had been divorced for 10 years. 30 years of marriage before that. People our age understand something younger folks often don't. Marriages rarely end because of one terrible thing. Usually they end because of 10,000 small things. Richard wasn't cruel. Not really. He simply needed to be the smartest person in every room. The strongest. The most important. And over time that need became exhausting. Especially because my work prevented me from correcting many of his assumptions. When I came home tired after deployments, he assumed I had spent months behind a desk. When nightmares woke me in the middle of the night, he blamed stress. When I stayed quiet during arguments, he mistook restraint for weakness. Near the end of our marriage, he'd started introducing me to people with a laugh. "This is Maggie. She retired from government paperwork and now terrorizes me with grocery lists." Everyone laughed, including me. Sometimes surviving a marriage requires the same skills as surviving other things. You pick your battles carefully. The last time I saw Richard was 2 weeks earlier at Emily's graduation party. He was standing near the grill wearing khaki shorts and confidence. His second wife, Dana, floated nearby with a glass of white wine and opinions about everything. Richard looked at me carrying folding chairs into the backyard. "You know, Maggie," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "retirement's been good to you." I looked down at the chair in my hands. "What makes you say that?" "You finally look relaxed." Dana laughed. "I think Richard means comfortable." Comfortable. A polite word. The kind people use when they don't want to say heavy. Older women know that language. We've heard it our entire lives. I smiled. "Comfort's underrated." Richard grinned. "Never change." I remember looking at him and wondering if he had any idea how little he actually knew me. The answer, of course, was no. At 9:17 p.m., my phone buzzed. I looked down. "Do you still have that blueberry pancake recipe?" 3 dots appeared, then vanished. No second message came. I called immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. A 3rd time. Nothing. Murphy lifted his head from the floor and watched me stand. Some instincts never leave you. The room suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. I picked up my car keys from the kitchen counter. My purse. My phone charger. Then I stopped long enough to look at the photograph hanging near the door. Emily at age 10 missing her front teeth holding up a fish she'd caught off the pier, smiling at the camera, trusting that if she ever needed me, really needed me, I'd come. I touched the frame once. Then I walked out the door. Because my daughter had just called in a distress signal. And somewhere across town my ex-husband was about to discover something he should have learned decades earlier. The quiet women are often the ones you should underestimate least. By 9:24 p.m. I was halfway across Norfolk. Traffic on Interstate 64 moved steadily for a Thursday night headlights, stretching ahead of me in quiet ribbons of white and red. The radio was off. The air conditioner hummed softly. Inside my head old habits were waking up, not the dramatic sort Hollywood likes to imagine. Real training doesn't feel exciting. It feels methodical. You slow your breathing. You eliminate assumptions. You collect facts. Fact number 1. Emily had used the code phrase exactly as we had practiced years ago. Fact number 2. She had not answered 3 phone calls. Fact number 3. A girl who had spent 18 years attached to her phone did not suddenly ignore her mother after sending an emergency message. Something had interrupted her. Or someone had. I pressed the hands-free button again. "Call Emily Collins." The call rang. Then voicemail. Again. "Hi, you've reached Emily." I ended the call before hearing the rest. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. 10 years earlier, after the divorce, Emily had become the bridge between 2 very different households. At my house, there were routines. Dinner at the table. Sunday phone calls to grandparents. Arguments that ended with conversations. At Richard's house, there were rules. Rules about appearance. Rules about grades. Rules about respect. Rules that somehow always seemed to apply to everyone except Richard. To be fair, he loved our daughter. I never doubted that. The problem was that Richard had always confused love with ownership, as if being a father made him a permanent authority instead of a temporary guardian, as if children were projects to manage instead of people to raise. My phone rang. The dashboard screen displayed a name I hadn't seen in almost 3 months. Frank Alvarez. I answered immediately. "Margaret." Frank had retired from the Navy 6 years after I had. These days he worked with a federal law enforcement task force in Virginia Beach. "What do you need?" No small talk. No questions about fishing or retirement. That was Frank. I received a distress signal from Emily. Silence. Then, the code? Yes. When? 9:17. Location? I don't know yet. Check the family tracker. Of course. I hated getting older sometimes, not because of the wrinkles or sore joints, because occasionally the brain reached for information just a little slower than it used to. Emily and I shared location access for emergencies. 3 taps later, her location appeared on the map. My stomach tightened. Maple Drive. Richard's house. "She's with her father," I said. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Could still be nothing." "It could." "You don't believe that?" "No, neither did he." "Keep me updated," he said. "And Margaret?" "Yes." "Remember you're retired." I almost smiled. "So is my left knee. Doesn't stop it from hurting when it rains." He laughed once. "Fair enough." The call ended. At 9:37 p.m., I turned onto Maple Drive. Richard's neighborhood had once represented success to him. Large brick homes, perfect lawns, 2-car garages. The kind of subdivision where every mailbox matched and every homeowner association meeting felt like a congressional hearing. His house sat near the end of the cul-de-sac, 3 bedrooms, colonial style, blue shutters. I had helped paint those shutters 23 years earlier. Funny what survives divorce. The first thing I noticed was Emily's car. Her Honda Civic sat in the driveway. The second thing I noticed was that another SUV was parked directly behind it, blocking it in completely. The third thing I noticed was that every curtain in the front of the house was closed. Richard hated closed curtains. He used to say they made people look suspicious. I parked across the street. For a full 30 seconds, I simply watched the house. Living room lights on, kitchen lights on, movement upstairs. No television glow, no music, no visible activity, just stillness. The wrong kind. I stepped out of the car. Virginia humidity wrapped around me immediately. As I walked toward the front door, memories came with me. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, Emily learning to ride a bicycle on this exact sidewalk. A marriage doesn't disappear when it ends. It just changes shape. I rang the bell. Nothing. I rang again. This time, footsteps approached. The door opened sharply. Richard stood there wearing jeans and an irritated expression. Maggie. Where's Emily? His eyebrows rose. Good evening to you too. Where is she? Upstairs. Put her on the phone. His expression hardened slightly. She's upset. About what? Teenage drama. I held his gaze. What happened? Nothing happened. Too fast. Too rehearsed. 30 years of marriage teaches you things. The tiny muscle that jumped near his left eye when he lied. The way he folded his arms when he felt cornered. The slight rise in his voice when he wanted control of a conversation. All three were happening. Let me speak to her. Richard sighed dramatically. Emily and Dana had an argument. About college. There it was. She needs time to cool off. I'll decide that after speaking with my daughter. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. Maybe. I mean it, Maggie. This is family business. I almost laughed. Family business. The phrase men use when they don't want witnesses. Then movement caught my eye. Second floor. The window above the garage. Emily. Only for a second. She pulled the curtain aside just enough for me to see her face. Then she lifted her hand. 2 fingers. Palm inward. Touch to shoulder. A gesture so quick most people would miss it. I didn't. Neither would anyone who had spent years communicating silently across crowded rooms. It was another signal. One we had practiced long ago while playing games during deployments. I couldn't explain to a little girl. I need help. Immediate help. The curtain closed. Richard followed my eyes. She's emotional. I pulled my phone from my pocket. What are you doing? Calling the police. His face changed instantly. For God's sake, Maggie, if she's fine, this will take 10 minutes. This is ridiculous. Then you have nothing to worry about. His voice rose. She's my daughter. I met his eyes. She's mine too. The dispatcher answered. I gave the address, explained the situation calmly, requested a welfare check. When I ended the call, Richard looked furious. Dana appeared behind him in the hallway. What is wrong with you? She demanded. I looked past both of them toward the staircase, toward the second floor, toward my daughter. Then I answered quietly, I've learned to trust evidence over explanations. Some lessons stay with you forever, and one lesson had kept me alive for 20 years. When someone asks for help, believe them, especially when they're risking everything just to ask. The first police cruiser arrived 7 minutes later. 7 minutes can feel like an hour when your child is inside a house and you don't know whether she's frightened, injured, or simply trapped in a situation she cannot escape. The red and blue lights reflected off the windows of the neighboring houses. Porch lights flickered on up and down the street. Curtains moved. Suburban America has always had a relationship with emergency lights. People don't stare because they're nosy. They stare because they hope it isn't someone they know. Officer Reynolds stepped out first. Mid-40s. Calm eyes. Wedding ring. The kind of police officer who had probably spent 20 years talking, frightened people through the worst evenings of their lives. Evening, folks. Richard immediately stepped forward. My ex-wife is overreacting. Officer Reynolds held up a hand. We'll figure that out. A second officer joined him. A younger woman named Officer Patel. Together they entered the house. I remained on the porch, waiting, listening, watching the upstairs window. Old habits die hard. You observe entrances, exits, potential problems, potential solutions. Not because you're looking for trouble, because trouble rarely announces itself politely. After several minutes, Officer Patel returned to the front door. Mrs. Collins? Yes. Could you come inside for a moment? The living room looked exactly as I remembered. Same fireplace, same oak bookshelves, Different furniture, different photographs, different life. Emily sat on the couch. The moment she saw me, she stood. I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around her. For a second, she held herself together. Then she wasn't 18 anymore. She was 6, she was 10, she was 14. She buried her face against my shoulder and cried quietly. Not hysterically, not dramatically, just relief. Pure relief. "I'm here," I whispered. "I know." Those 2 words carried more weight than most conversations. Officer Reynolds waited respectfully before speaking. "Miss Collins, can you tell us what happened?" Emily took a deep breath. "My stepmother took my phone yesterday." Dana folded her arms immediately. "Because she was being disrespectful." Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Emily continued. "Then Dad took my car keys." Richard looked offended. We needed to calm things down. "My passport, too," Emily said quietly. The room became still. Officer Reynolds looked up. "Your passport?" Emily nodded. "My college paperwork, too." I looked at Richard. He couldn't meet my eyes. Officer Reynolds turned toward him. "Sir..." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "We were trying to get her to slow down." "Slow down?" "She's 18 years old." "Exactly." Richard exhaled sharply. "She's making a mistake." Emily looked at him. "No, Dad, I'm making a decision." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Officer Reynolds asked the obvious question. "Why couldn't she leave the house?" Emily pointed toward the driveway. "My car was blocked in." Dana answered immediately. "Temporarily." Emily shook her head. "My phone was gone. My car was blocked. My documents were missing. And every time I tried to leave, Dad said we weren't done talking." Officer Patel wrote quietly in her notebook. Richard looked desperate now. "This sounds terrible when she says it like that." I almost laughed at the absurdity. How else was she supposed to say it? Officer Reynolds folded his notebook shut. "Sir, how long had this been going on?" Richard hesitated. 2 days. 2 days? My daughter had been trapped in that house for 2 days. Not tied up. Not locked in a basement. Something much more common. Much more American. Much easier to explain away. Control wearing the clothes of concern. I had seen versions of it before. Not overseas. Not in military operations. In ordinary families. Parents who couldn't accept that love changes shape as children become adults. Parents who confused guidance with ownership. Protection with possession. Richard rubbed his forehead. I was trying to protect her. Emily looked exhausted. "From what?" "The world." She shook her head slowly. "Dad, the world isn't what scares me right now." That landed harder than any accusation. Officer Reynolds glanced toward me. "Mrs. Collins, what made you believe your daughter was in danger tonight?" Before I could answer, Richard gave a short laugh. "My ex-wife watches too many spy movies." Nobody smiled. He continued anyway. "Emily sent some secret pancake message, and suddenly we're acting like it's an international hostage crisis." Officer Patel looked curious. "Pancake message?" I nodded. "When Emily was little, we established a distress code." Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You have a distress code with your daughter?" "Yes." Richard shook his head. "See what I dealt with for 30 years. I ignored him. Officer Reynolds asked, "Military background?" "Yes." "What branch?" "The Navy." Richard snorted. "Administrative work." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered the officer. "Operational support attached to special operations teams." Richard rolled his eyes. "Listen to that description." The front door opened. Everyone turned. Frank Alvarez stepped inside wearing plain clothes and carrying a badge on his belt. He spotted me immediately. "Commander Collins." The room fell silent. Not because he used my name, because he used my rank. Richard blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Frank nodded toward me. "Commander Margaret Collins, United States Navy, retired." Richard stared. "No," Frank looked confused. "No. She's a secretary." The words hung in the room. Emily actually laughed through her tears. A tired laugh. A disbelieving laugh. Frank looked at me. "You never told him?" I shook my head. There wasn't much point. Richard looked from Frank to me and back again. 20 years, he asked. I nodded once. 20 years. Doing what? Serving. Doing what? Some questions don't have answers you're allowed to give. Some never will. Frank rescued me. Enough that when she says she recognizes a distress signal, I listen. Richard sat down heavily in his own chair, as if gravity had suddenly increased, as if the room had tilted beneath him. For 30 years he had believed he knew exactly who I was. The dependable wife. The quiet mother. The dumpy housewife. The woman he explained to people at parties. And now that picture had developed a crack running straight through the center. He looked at me as though meeting me for the first time. The truth is, revenge rarely arrives with shouting or dramatic speeches. Sometimes revenge is simply the moment someone realizes they spent decades underestimating the person sitting across from them. And there is absolutely nothing they can do to take those years back. Richard looked at me the way people look at an old photograph they've suddenly realized they've been holding upside down. Not disbelief. Not exactly. Something closer to confusion, as though the pieces in front of him no longer fit together. "Commander," he finally said. Nobody answered immediately. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight slightly. Frank remained near the doorway. Emily sat quietly beside me on the couch, her hand still wrapped around mine. Richard looked at Frank. "You're serious?" Frank nodded once. "Very." Richard turned back toward me. "You were an officer?" "Yes." "For 20 years?" "Yes." He laughed once, not because he thought it was funny, because sometimes people laugh when reality changes shape faster than they can follow. "That's impossible." "It happened anyway." Dana folded her arms. "If she was some kind of officer, why didn't anyone know about it?" I looked at her. "Some people serve publicly. Some don't." Richard shook his head. "No." His eyes narrowed. "You worked in administration." "I worked where I was assigned." "You filed reports." "I wrote some." "You organized travel paperwork." "Sometimes." His frustration grew with every answer, because every answer sounded like confirmation while somehow proving the opposite. Finally, he snapped. "Then what exactly did you do?" The room became quiet. Even after retirement, there are questions you simply don't answer. Not because you're trying to sound mysterious, because you gave your word. And some promises outlive careers. "I served my country," I said. "That's the answer I can give you." Richard stared at me. For the first time in 30 years, he had no comeback. No joke. No sarcastic comment. Nothing. Frank finally stepped in. "Richard, there are military careers that don't fit neatly into cocktail party conversations." Richard ignored him. His eyes stayed on me. "I was married to you for 30 years. "I know. And I never knew any of this." I considered that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. "You never asked." The words landed harder than I intended. Maybe harder than he deserved. Or maybe exactly as hard as they needed to land. Because it was true. Richard never asked. Not really. There had been deployments, long absences, strange phone calls, sudden travel orders, entire stretches of our marriage that existed inside locked boxes I wasn't permitted to open. He accepted all of it because he assumed none of it mattered. Years earlier, after one deployment, I had come home exhausted in ways sleep couldn't fix. I remember sitting at our kitchen table long after midnight, unable to settle, unable to explain. Richard walked in wearing pajama pants and carrying a glass of water. "You still awake?" I nodded. "Long day." Another nod. He kissed the top of my head. "You government people and your paperwork deadlines." At the time, I simply smiled. Correcting him would have violated regulations. Besides, I was too tired. Now, sitting across from him all these years later, I realized something painful. He never wondered why paperwork left scars, or nightmares, or old injuries that acted up when storms rolled in from the Atlantic. He accepted the explanation because it required less effort than curiosity. Emily looked between us. "Dad, you seriously didn't know?" Richard looked embarrassed. "She never talked about work." I smiled slightly. "Neither did you." He opened his mouth, closed it again, because that was true too. For years, our dinner conversations revolved around his clients, his promotions, his frustrations, his ambitions. My stories stayed small, safe, convenient. Eventually, they disappeared altogether. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Collins, if you don't mind me asking?" I looked over. "Yes." "Was the distress code military training?" Emily answered before I could. "Mom taught me that when I was little." She smiled for the first time that night. "I thought it was a game." "It was," I said. "A useful one." Officer Patel nodded thoughtfully. "Honestly, that's not a bad idea." "It isn't." I looked toward Emily. "Children remember what adults repeat." Richard leaned back in his chair. His shoulders suddenly looked older. Smaller somehow. "Blueberry pancakes." Emily smiled faintly. "You told me nobody forgets pancakes." I was right. For a moment, despite everything, the room softened. Then Richard spoke quietly. "I called you boring." Nobody moved. He looked down at his hands. "The world's most boring sailor." I remembered. Company Christmas party. One too many glasses of wine. A room full of laughter. He looked back up. I said that, didn't I? Yes. His voice grew quieter. And the paperwork joke. Several times. Dana shifted uncomfortably. Richard continued. And the grocery lists. I nodded. He closed his eyes briefly. There are moments in life when people meet the consequences of words they spoke years earlier. Not because someone punished them. Because memory did. Memory can be remarkably patient. Richard opened his eyes. You let me say those things. Yes. Why? I considered the question carefully. Because the answer mattered. Because I didn't need strangers to respect me. I looked directly at him. But I did hope my husband would. The room became silent again. Not angry silence. Sad silence. The kind that arrives when everyone recognizes a truth at the same time. Emily squeezed my hand. Richard looked away first. Frank checked his watch. The officers are finishing paperwork. Officer Reynolds nodded. Miss Collins, since you're legally an adult, you're free to leave whenever you choose. Emily stood immediately. That hurt Richard more than anything else had. Not the police. Not my military record. Not Frank using my rank. The speed of her answer. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just decision. She looked at her father. I love you, Richard swallowed. I love you too. But I'm leaving with Mom. He nodded slowly. I know. Emily walked upstairs to gather her things. The room felt strangely empty without her. Richard stared at the floor. Finally, he asked the question that had probably been building for an hour. Were you really attached to SEAL teams? I looked at him. Sometimes. His eyes widened slightly. My God. I almost smiled. Not because I enjoyed his shock. Because of the irony. For decades, Richard believed strength had a specific appearance. Loud voices. Firm handshakes. Big personalities. Men who dominated rooms. He never imagined strength might look like a middle-aged woman buying tomatoes at the grocery store, or hanging bird feeders, or reminding him to schedule dentist appointments. He never imagined strength could sit quietly beside him for 30 years without announcing itself. The greatest revenge of my life wasn't exposing him, or humiliating him, or making him feel small. It was much simpler than that. The truth walked into the room. And suddenly all of his assumptions had nowhere left to hide. Emily didn't say a word during the drive home. Neither did I. Some silences need protecting. Norfolk drifted past outside the windshield in familiar pieces. Gas stations. Closed diners. A 24-hour pharmacy glowing against the darkness. Ordinary America continuing its business while private earthquakes reshaped private lives. Murphy greeted us at the front door with the enthusiasm only an old Labrador can manage at 10 o'clock at night. Emily knelt immediately and wrapped her arms around his neck. Murphy accepted this responsibility with dignity. Dogs understand emotional emergencies better than most people. He missed you? I said. Emily smiled weakly. I missed him too. A few minutes later, she sat at my kitchen table wearing one of my old sweatshirts and holding a mug of chamomile tea. Not drinking it, just holding it. Sometimes warmth matters more than taste. I sat across from her. Neither of us rushed. At our age, you learn that healing conversations cannot be forced. Eventually, she spoke. I kept thinking he would calm down. Your father. She nodded. At first, it was just discussions about college. She looked down at the mug. Then it became arguments. And then rules. Her voice grew quieter. Then suddenly I couldn't find my passport. My phone disappeared. My car keys disappeared. She looked up at me. And somehow everyone kept acting like I was the unreasonable one. I nodded slowly. That happens more often than people realize. She frowned. What do you mean? I chose my words carefully. Control rarely introduces itself as control. It usually arrives dressed as concern. I'm only trying to help. I'm protecting you. I'm doing what's best for you. Emily stared at the table. That's exactly what Dad kept saying. I reached across and squeezed her hand. Intentions matter. But actions matter too. She nodded quietly. After a while, she asked the question I knew was coming. Mom, yes. Were you really with the SEAL teams? I smiled. Sometimes. She laughed softly. That's still the weirdest answer I've ever heard. It happens to also be the most accurate one I can give. She leaned back in her chair. I feel like I don't know you at all. That one hurt a little. Not because she meant it cruelly. Because every parent hears that sentence eventually. I considered my answer. You know me better than almost anyone. I know your favorite pie is pecan. You cry during Christmas movies. You hate cilantro. You still sleep with the window cracked open even in winter. She smiled. That's true. The rest was my job. Jobs end. Families don't. She walked around the table and hugged me. This time I held on a little longer. By morning, the practical questions had arrived. Where would Emily stay until college started? What happened to the rest of her belongings? What legal paperwork needed updating? Growing older teaches you something younger people often miss. Life-changing moments are usually followed by paperwork. The police report resulted in no criminal charges. Emily was 18. Richard had not physically restrained her. The law lived in uncomfortable gray areas, but the officers had been very clear with him. Confiscating identification documents belonging to an adult could create serious legal problems. Preventing someone from leaving could create even bigger ones. Sometimes the law doesn't punish a person. It simply warns them that the next step will carry consequences. Richard heard that warning very clearly. 3 days later, he called. I let the phone ring twice before answering. Maggie. His voice sounded tired. Older. What do you need, Richard? I want to talk to Emily. She isn't ready. Silence. Then, I wasn't trying to hurt her. I know. I was trying to keep my family together. I looked out my kitchen window toward the bird feeder. A cardinal landed on the edge and looked around cautiously. Families aren't held together by locks, Richard. Another silence. Then he asked quietly, Did you really think I would hurt her? That question deserved honesty. I thought she believed she was in danger. That was enough for me. He exhaled slowly. Fair. The call ended there. No shouting. No accusations. Just exhaustion. Weeks passed. Emily moved fully into my house for the remainder of the summer. College orientation approached. Life moved forward because life always does. Then one afternoon Richard appeared on my porch. Alone. No Dana. No anger. No defenses. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. As though certainty itself had become heavy. I invited him inside. We sat at the kitchen table where Emily had done homework for years. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Finally he did. I'm sorry. No explanations, no qualifications, no if you felt hurt. Just the words. Simple. Direct. Rare. I waited. He looked down at his hands. I spent years thinking authority made me right. He shook his head. I thought being a father meant I knew better. You were trying to help. I know. But somewhere along the line I stopped listening. He looked up. And I spent 30 years treating you like you were smaller than you were. I didn't answer immediately. Because apologies deserve consideration. Not immediate forgiveness. Not immediate rejection. Consideration. Finally I spoke. Respect isn't something rank gives you, Richard. He nodded. I know that now. It's something character earns. His eyes watered slightly. I wish I'd learned it sooner. So do I. Outside, somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary lives. The world continuing as two older people sat across from each other, mourning a marriage that had ended years earlier, and mistakes that could no longer be undone. Then Richard surprised me. Would she be willing to try counseling? I looked at him carefully. Family counseling. He nodded. If she'll have me. That answer mattered. Because pride asks for forgiveness. Humility asks for help. There is a difference. When Emily came home later that afternoon, I told her about the conversation. She listened quietly. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Do you think he means it? I thought about the man I had married. The man I had divorced. The man sitting at my kitchen table earlier that day looking older than his years. Finally I answered. I think he wants to become the kind of father he thought he already was. She nodded slowly. Maybe that's a place to start. Sometimes accountability isn't destruction. Sometimes it's education. Sometimes the hardest consequence a person faces is finally seeing themselves clearly and deciding what to do next. By late August, the house had changed again. Suitcases stood near the front door. College brochures covered half the kitchen table. Emily's future had somehow become stacks of paperwork, dorm supply lists, and arguments about whether a young woman really needed 3 desk lamps. Apparently she did, at least according to the internet. Murphy seemed personally offended by every suitcase that appeared in the living room. He followed Emily from room to room as though constant supervision might prevent her from leaving. I understood the feeling. The morning we drove to Chapel Hill for move-in day, the sky over Virginia was perfectly clear. Emily spent most of the drive talking about classes, roommates, and meal plans. The kind of nervous excitement that belongs exclusively to 18-year-olds standing at the edge of their lives. Every few minutes she would fall quiet and stare out the window. Then she would start talking again. I recognized the pattern. Courage and fear taking turns. About halfway through North Carolina, she looked over at me. Are you okay? I smiled. Parents spend 18 years teaching children to leave. Then we act surprised when they do. She laughed. You're going to miss me. Terribly. Murphy, too. Especially Murphy. The university campus buzzed with controlled chaos. Minivans. Pickup trucks. Parents carrying mini refrigerators up stairwells as though participating in an Olympic event designed specifically for people over 50. It felt comforting somehow. Generation after generation repeating the same rituals. Moving boxes. Making beds, pretending not to cry. Emily's dorm room sat on the 3rd floor. By noon, we had unpacked everything except emotions. Those took longer. When it came time to leave, she hugged me tightly. Thank you for coming for me. I held her shoulders gently. There was never a version of this story where I didn't. Her eyes watered. Mine probably did too. At my age, I've stopped pretending allergies are responsible for everything. As I turned toward the hallway, another voice spoke behind me. Margaret! Richard! I turned. He stood near the doorway holding an awkwardly assembled toolkit and looking deeply uncomfortable inside a university dormitory. He had come separately. Emily had invited him. That mattered. Over the previous 2 months, counseling had begun doing its quiet work, not miracles. Counseling rarely produces miracles. It produces understanding, which is often more useful. Richard and Emily still had difficult conversations, still had painful moments, but they were having them honestly now. No one was confiscating phones. No one was blocking doors. No one was confusing authority with love. Richard looked at Emily. You ready for this? She smiled. No, he laughed. Good answer. Then he hugged her. Not the quick, distracted hugs fathers sometimes give daughters. A real hug. The kind that admits fear. When he stepped back, his eyes were red. Call if you need anything. Emily grinned. I know. He glanced at me. For just a moment, 30 years of marriage and 10 years of divorce sat quietly between us. Not gone. Not forgotten. Just quieter than before. The drive home felt longer. The house felt larger. Empty bedrooms have a sound to them. Parents know exactly what I mean. 3 weeks later, Richard called. Not because there was a problem. Not because he wanted something. Simply because he wanted to talk. After a few minutes discussing Emily's classes, he grew quiet. Then he asked the question I think had been waiting inside him ever since Maple Drive. Why didn't you ever tell me? I knew what he meant. The military. Yes, you let me believe all kinds of things. I considered the question carefully. Then I answered. Because respect that arrives after medals isn't respect. He stayed quiet. I continued. If someone only values you after learning your titles, your rank, your accomplishments. I looked out the window toward the bird feeder. They never valued you in the first place. He didn't argue, because he knew. After a long silence, he said quietly, I wish I'd seen you sooner. I smiled sadly. I was always standing in front of you, Richard. After we hung up, I sat on my porch as evening settled over the neighborhood. The Cardinals returned. Murphy slept beside my chair. The world kept moving the way it always does. People often imagine revenge as destruction, as humiliation, as winning. Life has taught me something different. Real revenge is sometimes much quieter. It's the moment truth enters a room and asks everyone to see clearly. The moment a daughter learns her voice matters. The moment a father learns love cannot survive ownership. The moment an old wound finally stops demanding to be reopened. As for me, I never needed Richard to discover who I had been. I only needed Emily to know who I would always be. The person who came when she called. Every time. No matter what. If this story leaves anything behind, I hope it's this. Never mistake quiet for weakness. Never confuse control with care. And never assume the ordinary people sitting beside you haven't lived extraordinary lives you simply never thought to ask about. If you've ever been underestimated, or if you've ever discovered hidden strength in someone you love, I hope you'll carry that lesson forward. And if this story reminded you of someone worth calling, forgiving, thanking, or listening to a little more carefully, perhaps today is a good day to do it. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never ignore the people brave enough to ask for help.